Hi, I'm Shashank Bhargava, and you're listening to Three Things, the Indian Express news show. As you probably know, forest trees form a very important part of our climate cycle. Forests absorb a lot of carbon dioxide, which is a major contributor to climate change. So like our school books told us, the more forests we have, the better it is for the environment. And because they're so important, in its latest investigation, the International Consortium of Investigative Journalists, or ICIJ, spread across 27 countries, decided to focus on the cutting down of these trees. And they did this as part of their investigation, Deforestation Inc. The India leg of this investigation was done by the Indian Express, and it revealed details not only about large-scale deforestation, but the failure to truly compensate for it, the lack of official transparency, and the business of dealing in teak wood that supports a military regime.
So I must begin by saying that this was a different kind of collaboration that we did with the ICIJ.
That's investigative journalist Ritu Sarin, who along with Mazoomdaar and Amitabh Sinha were part of the Indian Express's investigation team for this project.
And as it turned out, the size of the collaboration was, say, we were about 120 reporters from 27 countries working with 40 media houses that joined hands on this one. And actually 9 months, but the active investigation, I think, took us about 6 months.
In this episode, we take a detailed look at the findings of this investigation and talk to the team that was involved in it. And we begin by talking about India's forest cover. Now, according to official records, for the past 40 years, around 1/5 of India has consistently remained under green cover. But this is not really true, and it has a lot to do with how we define forests.
So this is something which is not a secret.
That's Indian Express's Mazoomdaar.
There is a global definition of forest because the UN and FAO, they had to come to a global benchmark for this so that international data could be comparable. So they gave a broad framework that any land unit, at least 1 hectare in size, and if it has 10% tree canopy cover, that means the foliage that you see, if you look up, if that foliage covers 10% of the land, then it will be considered a forest. So our definition is also the same. We also go by the same unit size, minimum 1 hectare and at least 10% canopy density. But there is a big difference in the sense that if you apply common sense, then there would be many such patches of land which would meet this definition, but they are very unlike forests because the land use is different.
Meaning that in India, absolutely any area that has a 10% canopy cover is technically counted as a forest, no matter what that area is being used for. In the investigation, Jay found out that roadside trees, urban housing areas, and even VIP bungalows in Delhi are being counted as forests. And this is the reason why that despite industrialization and a growing population, India's forest cover on paper has actually increased by 2% since the 1980s.
This is quite counterintuitive if you think about that because we're talking about 4 or 5 decades of time span in which India's population nearly doubled, and the other major factors in terms of the land encroached or diverted to non-forest use like development, agriculture, that went up manifold. And still, it's physically incongruous that having met all those demands, it would still increase your forest cover. So the only way this could have happened, and many experts over the years have pointed out that this is a manipulation of data, and we are quite openly counting plantations.
And here he says that there are 2 kinds of plantations. One plantation is one that is inside a forest. Now, although it does not serve the purpose of the main forest, it is still inside one and it is not being used for agriculture. But the other kind of plantation is one that is purely commercial, like rubber plantations or mango orchards. And because of India's definition of a forest, they also count as one. For example, Jay tells us what happens in the case of tea plantations, which, like you would have guessed, also count as forests.
What happens is that in every tree garden, in the North India in particular, as a farming practice, if you visit any tree garden, you will see scattered shade trees. The tree grows always under scattered shade trees. And these trees provide shade, and also they meet the basic requirements of the tree labor force, firewood, etc. And these trees are maintained, harvested, and again grown by the management. Now, these shade trees will add up to show more than 10% canopy cover. So, though tea gardens, and there are hundreds and thousands of square kilometers of tea gardens in India, they are not a part of forest cover by definition. Just because they have these shade trees, which add up to 10% canopy cover, they all come under forest cover. So this happened in a way that our real true quality forest cover, even 4 decades back, 5 decades back, we didn't have probably more than 10-12%. And even from that, in these decades, we have further lost about 10%. And that loss was overcompensated by this kind of plantations and any random forest patch which meets the definition. And that's how this growth is visible on paper.
Now, even though commercial plantations might look green, there's a big difference between them and actual forests, especially in terms of how they help the environment and support wildlife.
The first thing here is that a natural forest is diverse. It has, to put it in layman's term, it has many types of plants and flora, which meets the need of many kinds of animals and insects and the fauna. So you have a natural system which supports a very wide range of life form. And this is not possible in a plantation where the types of plants are limited and the life forms to support, therefore, are naturally limited.
Think about it this way. A tiger or a panther can live in an actual forest, but not on a tea plantation.
And even if you look beyond the big mammals, tigers, elephants, etc., even in terms of insects, the smallest ones, any 10 by 10 feet patch of natural forest, you will have more insects than in a huge tea garden where you use so much pesticide. Even in the organic ones, you use natural pesticide, and it's part of your farming framework that you cannot have insects, and they take the name of pests. So that's how it works. And the second thing is the plantations are new. They are man-made. Even the best of plantations that we have are a decade or 2 decades old. So they may grow into natural forests over a long period of time. But it's again a no-brainer, and that a forest which developed naturally over hundreds of years, and if you cut it down, and as compensation, if you plant some trees in twice the area or even thrice the area, to reach that level of ecosystem services, that level of biodiversity, it will take a long time. So it is not scientifically, biologically possible to compensate old natural forests with some random plantation or even well-planned, well-thought-out plantation.
Jay points out that only 2/3 of India's recorded forest area is forested today. And out of that, dense forests, even counting the plantations grown by the government, account for only 10% of the country. Now, for the investigation, Jay accessed forest cover data, which the government since the 1980s has refused to share with the media. And they, for the first time, give a glimpse into what counts as a forest in the official interpretation. He says that even though the data is collected using public money, it is not freely available to the public.
FSI, Forest Survey of India, they do offer you this data at a cost. For that, one needs to apply, and if they are satisfied, then they share some data with the condition the applicant has to give an undertaking that this data will not be shared with the media. So it's a clear policy of the government that there is something about this data which should not be shared in the public. And so that's why it took quite a long time. I mean, we have been writing about these issues, about this broad definition, about this anomalies for over a decade. But to access the actual georeferenced files to see what goes in the name of forest, really, it took us quite a while, and there was no official channel to access this data.
He says that the definition of forest that India uses was probably necessary when we didn't have the advanced technology that we have now. And that is why it is time to change it, along with making the forest data freely available to the public.
And FSI also conducts a backup survey to check if their analysis which is done based on satellite images and done digitally. This analysis is correct or not, and they send out small teams to certain areas to check if their analysis and the real ground picture they're matching. But because of resource limitation, barely 6,000 locations are covered. So the idea was that if this data is freely available to public, and given the awareness that we have in the society today, anyone can volunteer and go and check out for the government and report that what is the quality of this data. So I think in future, that is the way it should be done. And this is too important a policy input to be kept under the wraps. So it should be open and it should be available to anyone to volunteer, go out, check, and help improve the quality of the data.
So one problem that the investigation has focused on is what the forest cover data does not reveal and the lack of transparency in the system. But the other major focus was on a law that was passed by the parliament a few years ago. This is the Compensatory Afforestation Law. And to understand this, we talked to Amitabh Sinha, who investigated this part of the story. He began by telling us what stands out about this law.
It's a very unique program, one of its kind in the entire world, wherein what the companies or a project proponent or anyone who is diverting forests, basically anyone who is cutting down forests for any other purpose, like industrialization, like mining, for example, or infrastructure projects, you are constructing a highway through, or you're laying down train tracks, for example, or you are setting up industries. For whatever reason, if you are cutting down forests, then whoever is cutting down forests, that company or that individual is supposed to compensate for the forests being cut by doing afforestation projects.
So in this regard, companies that are cutting down forests actually have to pay money to support afforestation projects. And the amount of money is decided based on the size of the forest and the current value of the forest.
Now, those are only two components. There are other levies and other fees also that these companies have to pay once they are diverting forests. So money is only one part of it. The companies have to pay the compensatory afforestation money, and that money goes into an account and that's used only for afforestation. So the money comes into the central fund, and then according to the share of the states, depending on how much forests has been cut in which state, money goes back to the states. And then the state governments, they release it to the state forest departments, which actually do the afforestation exercise. So that's the cycle, right? So it's a very unique program.
But despite its uniqueness, the investigation found out that the program is not being utilized well and has been witnessing a lot of major problems.
So there were two things that we observed. One, of course, is the money that is coming in, and there is a huge amount of money. As I said, there are a whole lot of levies, fees, different kind of compensatory afforestation money that is being levied for afforestation purposes, right? So in the last 5 years itself, nearly 70,000 crore rupees has come in this fund, which is meant only for afforestation purposes. So 70,000 crores has come nationally across for diversion of, in lieu of cutting down of forests.
Now, despite this huge sum of money that has been collected, only about 40% of it has been used since 2018. So around 22,000 crore rupees.
The rest is being locked in the state government accounts for a fairly long period of time now. So what we found is that a large proportion of money meant for afforestation is not being used for that purpose for a relatively long period of time. Now, there is one caveat I think it's worthwhile to mention. Of course, not all this money can be spent at one go. It's not meant to just go and buy a vehicle, for example, that you spend all that money. Because afforestation, it's an exercise that keeps on happening every year, right? So you probably need to put out money in tranches. So it's not that all the money that goes to the states this year, all of it would be spent this year itself. It doesn't happen like that. So we have to take into account that kind of process as well.
And besides the bureaucracy and the red tape, the other thing that Amitabh points out is that you have to plant trees at a certain time of the year, usually just before the monsoons. And if you miss that window and don't release the money on time, the process gets further delayed. But even besides this money not being utilized, the other big problem is where the trees are being planted.
Most of these places are not conducive to growing of plants or forests. So these are very low quality land, low quality meaning not very fertile land. And that's not very surprising. If the land was very useful or very fertile, why would you give it away for forests? So it would be used for something else. So it's not very surprising. The land that comes in for afforestation, the land that is identified for afforestation, is usually the land that cannot be used for any other purpose.
So because of this, what is being cut are very good quality forests, but what is being planted in place of that is nowhere near that quality. And Amitabh actually visited some of these sites and saw this firsthand.
One of the places not very far from Raipur in Chhattisgarh, I had gone to see a few patches there. So extremely rocky. Nothing was growing before they had done a plantation there. Absolutely. And you can make out probably nothing ever will grow there. I mean, I could see that plantations had been done. In fact, at one of the sites, the plantation had actually come up quite well. It was almost like merging into the nearby forests. And there was a fair amount of growth at that place. So that was actually a good example of the afforestation project. But a few other sites that I saw, I mean, you can imagine rocks, and in between rocks, you had planted these saplings. And there was some effort being made to keep them going, but unlikely that these would develop into good quality forests. So that was another thing. Also, the fact that while the forests being cut are like one patch of forest getting cut, what is coming up is disjointed small patches of land where plantations are happening. So just as an example, if you're cutting 1 hectare of forest land, you don't get 1 hectare of land to raise plantations. What you usually get is 10 or 15 or 20 different patches of land that will add up to 1 hectare.
So that means even if these plantations end up with fully grown trees, they will not become fully grown forests. They will only remain a group of trees. And Amitabh also says that many people have criticized this program because they say that this in a way has legitimized the cutting down of trees.
Once you're able to pay the money, you should be able to cut down forests. So that's one of the criticisms that is often made, that it is a typical greenwashing that happens, that you pay for the money and you say a plantation is being created, so we have already compensated for the forests, and therefore it is very legitimate to cut down the forests.
But this is not to say that the program itself is a wasteful exercise. It's just that it is facing a lot of issues right now, both in terms of how the money is not being utilized and the way the trees are being planted.
You probably would never be able to replace natural forests with these kind of plantation exercise. But what we found is that you could do much better than what you are doing right now. And at least, compensate in some way for the environmental loss that you are creating.
Now, so far we have talked about how India defines forests and the many problems with the compensatory afforestation program. But now we talk about another aspect of the investigation that has had a lot of global significance. And this involves teak wood from Myanmar, which is really sought after. And we'll let investigative journalist Ritu Sarin tell us what makes it so special.
It's just the best, in the sense, considered to be the champagne if you're talking about drinks, or the king of woods or whatever. It's highly, highly sturdy, versatile, plus termite proof, and it weathers very well. And it is just about indispensable for something like ship decking and yachts. Because Burmese teak and Myanmar teak is indispensable for yachts. You have to have it.
Ritu was the one who investigated the Myanmar teak for this investigation. And she says that a number of countries, including the US, UK, and the European Union, have placed sanctions against the Myanmar forest industry after the country's military force junta executed a coup back in 2021. These countries believe that trading with Myanmar right now is to help sustain the military regime there.
So besides other natural resources, say like oil, it is what the country and what the regime there now earns from timber and primarily teak, sort of sustains them also. And it is all state controlled. And even after the coup, there have been over a dozen auctions that the state has held for sale of the teak and timber out of Myanmar. That is one aspect. The other, of course, is the degradation of the forests of the country, and almost to the size of Switzerland, according to some calculations. So Myanmar is losing a lot of its green cover at a very rapid pace. There is a lot of smuggling going on along the borders of China and India, and the seizures that have taken place along the Indian border also bear that out.
Now, even though some Western countries have placed restrictions on Myanmar and are not willing to buy teak from the country, India has placed no such restrictions. And this is why India is regarded as a leakage country, meaning that teak from Myanmar comes to India and is then exported to other Western countries.
So it's a trade data that shows that active consignments of teak are going from some Indian firms to Europe and America. And global trade data again shows that America and the EU still manage to get their supplies.
In fact, she says that some global environment watchdogs have been keeping an eye on a few Indian firms that import teak from Myanmar.
I studied a pile of reports of the EIA. They have done not one, but maybe half a dozen very, very sustained investigations into different countries' links into Myanmar teak, Croatia, Italy and all that. And at least in 2 reports, India comes up quite prominently. Because remember that China and India alternate between being the highest importers of Myanmar teak. So right now we may be at number 2, but we have been at number 1. So we are a very prominent importer of teak from that country.
And it is important to note that because India has not banned teak from Myanmar, it continues to be used domestically as well. Now, Ritu also spoke to traders who export teak, and they put the onus on the buyers that if they have a problem, then they should get the wood tested themselves.
What some of the importers told me was that, if you're asking me which teak am I sending to the European countries, they can do a DNA test. That is their reply. But DNA testing is a very nascent sort of, for wood products, is just not done. I think one laboratory has been opened in Bangalore recently, but it's just not done on items like wood. So when I went to Nagpur, and their timber market is called Lakkadpur, spoke to a lot of traders, a lot of people who used to be importing wood from Myanmar, still are, some of them domestically, and some large exporters also. Then I also spoke to the forest officials. Of course, because it is wood and there is quite a bit of checking, like they give gate passes whenever any truck moves out of Lakkadpur laden with wood. But if they are told it's imported, they just write imported. So as of now, in a place like Nagpur, where there are about 600 sawmills, it's one of the largest Indian timber hubs in the country. So in the gate passes that are made for when the wood goes out and then goes in the form of shipments, they write imported. They never give the origin of the wood. So there's small things like this are sort of the conclusions of our local investigation.
Ritu says that this was an important story from the global perspective and required going through a lot of minute details.
A lot has been written about Myanmar smuggling of teak and timber by environmental groups, by the Environmental Investigation Agency and several other organizations. And this probably was the first time that over 100 journalists were writing about the same thing. And it required minute leads to be shared with each other, And when India Links came up, then there were a lot of reporters from all over Europe who wanted me to go to the spots and who wanted inputs from me. So there was very, very active collaboration on this story.
Now, because of climate change goals, environmental concerns and military regimes in Myanmar's case, many countries want to make sure that the products they use are not made by deforestation or by illegally cutting forests. And this is where the forest certification industry comes in, an industry that has cropped up in India in the last 15 years or so. And to understand more about it, we hear from Amitabh Sinha again.
The whole idea of certification industry is to say, okay, we are the ones who would certify whether these products are coming from sustainably managed forests or not. And they also certify the forest areas themselves. So they would go and say, okay, this particular stretch of forests, say some, forest patch in Uttar Pradesh, for example, they would go and see, and they would certify that this is an area which is being managed sustainably by whoever is managing it. In India's case, it would be the forest department, but they would say this is managed sustainably, and therefore any raw material coming out of that forest, it would be labeled okay, it would be labeled as certified, and therefore it is good for commercial use anywhere in the world.
And the thing to note is that there is not much demand for this in India, but these certificates help those who export wood, especially to places like Europe and the US.
Basically, those are the two markets that have a regulation right now. Even they do not ask for certified goods. They are not saying that only certified goods would be able to access our markets. What they are saying is they want to ensure that it's not coming from illegal sources. So the only criteria that they are applying is legality. Now, once you have this certification, that's one way it helps your case. It helps your clearance move a little faster. So it's not a compliance market, as in the European and the US markets are not saying that you have to be certified in order to get into a market. What they are saying is you have to show that you are sourcing your products from legal sources, right? So if I get those certifications, it makes my job easier.
And forest certifications are issued for a whole host of purposes. To ensure that a forest is being managed sustainably, for example, or whether a product itself has been made using sustainable methods. But Amitabh says that this entire industry is in a mess right now, and a lot of certificates that get issued are essentially meaningless.
In the sense that if you look a little more closely and if you follow the chain, most of these certifications or the certificate holders are not able to ensure the kind of promises that are implicit in the certification. The certification would actually give you the assurance that, say 50 or 60 different kinds of parameters are being met. And if you look closely, then in a majority of those cases, a lot of these parameters would not be met.
He says that this is an example of greenwashing, where products are being certified as sustainable even though they cannot guarantee that. And the investigation reveals that this is extremely rampant in India.
Which means that products that were coming from illegal or at least unknown sources, those were also getting certified. Timber traders or people in that supply chain which were not following all the norms, they were getting certified. And a lot of these people, some of these key players, they told us on record that the integrity of most of these certifications were in doubt.
And the other thing to note is that many in the Indian Forest Department do not like the idea of a private forest certification industry.
So the argument is that Indian forests are already very well managed and there is no deforestation happening in the Indian forests in any case. And that if at all we need any standards, so it should be government standards. So why doesn't the government itself come up with its own standards of forest management? And during our investigation, we also reported the Indian government is actually now in the process of framing new forest standards for itself. And that would be good enough for any product originating in those forests to be sold in any international market. So that is on its way. That is happening.
Amitabh says that what this investigation highlights is that a lot of work needs to be done in different areas concerning forests, and that there are many red flags that need our attention.
So we are raising those red flags for the governments, for the policymakers, for the industry to look at and just tighten their belts a little further, saying there are large amount of discrepancies in what is being promised by way of sustainable management of forest, which are actually not being followed in practice. So in a way, there is a lot of greenwashing happening in the forestry sector, which needs to be stopped in the interests of the overall climate objectives.
Now, before we go ahead, let's take a quick recap. So far, we have discussed how the forest certification industry is in a mess, the dubious timber trail of Myanmar, and the larger problems with India's forest sector, including a big lack in transparency. But in the end, we talk about Buckswaha. a small village in Madhya Pradesh that Ritu wrote about as part of this investigation. It's a place that encapsulates a lot of problems we have been talking about so far. The village lies in the Chhatarpur district of the state, and people there mostly live off the forest and survive on traditional agricultural practices. And what makes this area special is that it is home to one of Asia's largest and most precious diamond mines. But despite this, no mining is taking place because of ongoing protests and a High Court order that has put a stay on it. When we spoke to Ritu, she told us why the team chose to write about this place.
I think we picked this because it gave a very good representational view. That's one. Two, it's a very backward, underdeveloped part of the country. It is listed as a backward region. And three, what is at stake is a lot of trees. In fact, here we have a precise tree count.
215,875 to be precise.
So we have a precise tree count. Of course, I had to go there and actually saw the variety of plantations in the forest. And it was quite fascinating. And I must tell you that after speaking to all sorts of stakeholders, including the district administration, including the villagers, including the environmentalists, the lawyers who have filed PILs for this case, I did come back with the feeling that if this is actually one of the largest diamond reserves in Asia, as is being claimed and as has come out from the early mining that has been done by an Australian company, well, the diamonds should come out.
And she says that after having spoken to the people who live in the area, the Australian company she talks about is Rio Tinto, which had been there from 2006 to 2016. But it left after it failed to make a headway in the area. Ritu says that the people there actually had good things to say about the company.
And I could see the kind of works they have done. There are 15 villages in the mining spot. And I could see the wells they have dug or the connectivity they have given to some roads. They employed, I think it was about 360 people. When they were doing the perspective mining, they drilled deep in. They set up a processing plant for the diamonds. All that was done. And the villagers had good things to say about them. Like the boy who took me to the precise point where the drilling was done said that because they worked with the mining company for 2 years, or some had worked for 3 years, which were among the most productive years of their lives. Rio Tinto, that is the Australian company, even compensated them for subsequent years, So each of them got compensation when the company left. And now they're wondering what the new company is doing. So besides direct employment, the region benefited. I could see that. So somewhere, I think, solution has to be found. The villagers say that if mining is renewed or if the mine is set up, then it should be one employment given to each family. That kind of formula. The entire region benefits in terms of employment. And then there are other spin-off benefits, like the new company is SL Mining of the Aditya Birla Group. And from the CSR funds, they have brought in some medical equipment to the government hospital, X-ray machines and ambulance and all that. But because the whole matter went to court, some PILs were filed, well, everything is stayed. There's nothing happening on the ground as we speak.
Now, one could argue that maybe it does make sense to start mining in the region so that people get jobs and there is more development in the area. But based on how poorly our compensatory afforestation measures are being implemented, we know that replacing those 215,875 trees would not really be possible. And that's a big worry from the environmental perspective.
Of course, there are many other complexities, like it's a water scarce region. Where will all the waste and the dump be disposed of? How will it be disposed of? It's a complex issue. There is no industrial development around Buxwaha and Chhatarpur district at all, almost at all. So that aspect is there. So I think the final thoughts that we came back with from all our spot investigations is, one, the lack of transparency and the willingness to share details and data, even about things like afforestation, about imports of forest produce and say timber and teak from other countries, and also the absence of data, which we realized that our partners had plenty of, but in India, trade data, customs data is lacking quite significantly.
She says that on the ground there are lapses and laxity. And like Amitabh said earlier, the government should be looking into this.
In India, like in many parts of the world, there's a multiplicity of agencies. Of course, we have the Ministry of Environment, but things like certification, absolutely neglected. There is no science, and vested interests needlessly do get created. So India has to begin to take these things seriously. Even the import of teak from Myanmar. I mean, there has to be far more regulation, far more scrutiny, and far more action against people who are working in interests which are detrimental to the environment of some regions.
You were listening to Three Things by the Indian Express. Today's show was written and produced by me, Shashank Bhargava, and was edited and mixed by Suresh Pawar. If you like the show, then do subscribe to us wherever you get your podcasts. You can also recommend the show to someone you think will like it, share it with a friend or someone in your family. It's the best way for people to get to know about us. You can tweet us at Express Podcasts and write to us at podcasts@indianexpress.com.